Hello and welcome to the Small Agency Show. I'm Chip Griffin, the founder of Saga, the Small Agency Growth Alliance, and today we're talking about Winfluence, the brand new book by Jason Falls. So let's get into the show. Got to do the obligatory chair dancing thing here, which nobody really wants to see us do, but
good tunes.
You gotta have a little something to wake up and get started. So, Jason, welcome to the show. It is fantastic to have you here. You've been on my show before, but this is the first time that you'll be talking on this show about the book.
Yeah.
Let's go solo here so I can hold it up nice and big for people to see.
Sweet. There it is. There we go. That's good stuff. Thanks for having me, man.
It's great to have you here, and I'm glad you said yes, despite the fact that I troll your weekly live show.
Your trolling of my show makes it worth doing a lot of times. I mean, I love doing the show regardless, but I love like sneaking in and seeing what you're saying over in the comments. Even if I don't bring it up, I just get a kick out of it.
Well, as you know, my goal is to try to break you, and to cause you to kind of smirk or maybe even burst out laughing someday, and then your guest just says, "What's going on, Jason? Did I say something funny?"
Every now and then you do it, so it's good.
I can see the little twitch of the smirk on your face when you do it. But it is a great show, and for those of you who are not already watching that weekly live stream, it's currently at 8 a.m. Eastern time on Tuesdays. I hope it stays at 8 a.m. Eastern time because that works better for me, but I understand you may want to move to midday so that perhaps West Coast people have a better time being guests and viewers.
I have a tough time getting the West Coasters to agree to be on the show because it means they have to get up before 5 a.m. and be ready to be on television. So we've been talking about maybe moving the start time. Haven't decided yet, but yeah, it's 8 a.m. on Tuesdays on my channels or the Cornet channels, which are at Team Cornet.
It's on like 17 different places, I think.
Yeah, it's all over the place.
But people should come watch on YouTube because that's where I troll, and so it'd be more fun to have some people.
We would love to have more subscribers on YouTube. Right now the YouTube channel is basically Chip and random people, one or two a day that come in there. So we'd like to have some more people over on YouTube. So do it there. That'd be great.
Same here. It's probably the same one or two people. But in any case, all right. Enough of that jibber jabber. Let's talk about why you're really here. And it is Winfluence, which is a tremendous book. I actually devoured it in one sitting because it was that compelling. And I have to tell you, as someone who reads a lot of social media books and business books, most of them are dry, shall we say? But you did a very nice job of keeping the pace flowing, and I think that's fantastic. So why don't you tell us, what is Winfluence?
Well, thank you for the kind words on the book. So Winfluence is basically, it's not a how-to book on influencer marketing, although there is how-to in it. There's a chapter that's devoted to here's the 6 steps to building influence marketing campaigns, and I've got all that in there. But I really wanted to throw out a hypothesis and a proposal to rethink the way we think of influence marketing or influencer marketing, because I think the term influencer with the R on the end of it has biased us. It's backed us into a corner, and it makes us automatically think of, sort of superficial peace sign duck lips people on Instagram or YouTubers. And if you really think about what you're strategically trying to do, you're trying to influence an audience to take action. So if you think about influence marketing without the R, as opposed to influencer marketing, now all of a sudden your perspective broadens a little bit. And you're like, okay, well, if I'm trying to influence this audience, it might be a social media person on Instagram or YouTube or LinkedIn or Twitter, but it might also be the president of the local PTA, depending upon who the audience is and depending upon what my business or brand is trying to do. So if you think about it in a much more broad perspective, it almost, sort of falls into the line of either public relations or word of mouth, and you're not just narrowing in on social media influencers. And I think when you rethink influence marketing that way, or rethink influencer marketing and think about it as influence marketing, it opens the door for you being a lot smarter strategically with what you're trying to do.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And influencer marketing with the R, which we don't even say ever here in New England anyway, right? Because it's influencer marketing.
Exactly.
here in New England, but it's really gotten a bad name in recent years, and I mean it's the kind of thing where I think some people view it as a shortcut,
Mhm.
and so you've got some brands, some agencies out there who say, well, we can do this, and we can just pay someone to say something nice about it, and boom, sales will take off, and it hasn't always been done in, say, the most ethical way. So I think reframing it and rethinking about how you're doing it is important.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely not just the label of influencer that makes people think a little differently. It's also the behavior of some, and certainly the behavior that has been called out by the mainstream media is typically the worst case scenario. It's typically the influencers who are, faking their existences, they're airbrushing or photoshopping in clouds, that are doing things that make it disingenuous. Whereas, 80-90% of what's out there are these beautiful content creators who have built really highly engaged audiences that trust them, and when brands partner with them, things actually happen good for the brand. And so that's the world of influence marketing, whereas this little sliver of influencer marketing over here that we often think about is a subset that is a fringe element that will probably die out because it's not real productive.
Well, in all marketing and communications activities throughout the years have had bad actors, right? So, it's unfair to taint all of this particular space with those few bad actors. They're just the ones that get all the attention.
That's very true. Yeah, as you know, and I think people who have been kind of following along with me for the last couple of weeks know, there's a documentary on HBO right now called Fake Famous, which basically portrays influencers in that very superficial, fraudulent behavior of buying followers, buying engagement via bots and things like that. And the movie tries to make it out to be, this is how influencers exist. This is how all influencers do this, and it's literally a very fraction of a percent of the ones that are out there. So this book, along with, what I talk about on my podcast and the interviews that I do and whatnot, is really all about helping businesses understand, and agencies that serve those businesses understand, the path to strategic success using influencers, which is a little bit more detailed, a little bit more refined.
And the whole idea of influencers, it's not really new, right? I mean, that's what marketing and communications has been about for forever. It's just it's now been packaged that way, and now you're repackaging it as Winfluence. But Winfluence. I'm being unfair. It's not just a repackaging. It is really thinking about it differently. I think in the book you say it's thinking about is it about the channel and not the individual? I forget exactly the way you put it, but essentially that was the framing of it.
Yeah, I say it's not about the individual, the channel, the noun. It's about the verb. It's about what you're trying to do, right? So you're trying to influence. You're not trying to influence her. Influencer is just the mechanism, the person that you might use, or the people that you might use to get to the end goal. But the end goal is the focus, and that's what you need to focus on. So that's another talking point in the argument for widening that perspective and saying influence marketing. But you're right, it's not new. It's been around forever. It's what public relations people do in their day-to-day lives. They try to work with influential voices in the media, typically, to carry forth the talking points, the messages, the news, the information about their clients' products or their brand's products that they want to get out there. But it dates all the way. I mean, celebrity endorsements are influence marketing to a degree as well. It's a special category, but if you're talking about that, you're going to go back to the 1700s and the Queen's pottery with Josiah Wedgwood. So I think it was Queen Caroline asked Josiah Wedgwood to create specific pottery, and he called it the Queen's pottery, which was an endorsement, which was using the influence of her name and endorsement to sell more products. So it dates back centuries. It's not new at all.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one thing that is different is the number of people and the ease of access to megaphones, right? So you have a section in there where you talk about sort of the history of media, the evolution of media, and it sort of just makes me feel old. Although it's actually, I'm giving a talk later today to a college class on the evolution of PR over the last 30 years. And I remember when I was a kid, and I could barely get 4 TV stations on my parents' TV. Now not only do we have all of the TV, the cable networks and that kind of stuff, we have YouTube, we have things like this, right? So you and I have our own megaphones. We have the ability, not necessarily the reality, but the ability to talk to a lot of people whenever we feel like it. So that's really one of the key things that's changed, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you said, 30 years ago, in order to, have something written in a medium that a lot of people saw, you either had to be a trained journalist or editor or producer or a trained, whether that be a written, a journalist who writes things, or you had to be a radio reporter or a television reporter. And to be on the radio and television, you have to have a license from the FCC, which is not hard to get, but at the same time, you had to jump through some hoops. There were some filters before you could actually get the word out there. If you wanted to write a book, you had to go through a publisher who approved it and all that kind of stuff. Self-publishing wasn't a thing back then. So the internet and social media created the ability for anybody to create content. Unfortunately, almost everybody's trying to create content. So you've got this huge sea of noise. The signal that's rising out of that noise, though, are the content creators that are creating relevant information out there that people want, but whether it's information or entertainment or perspective or, the things that influential people who are creating content online bring to the table attract audiences, and people want to consume that content. And the magic of having everybody having the potential of being a content creator is someone can create content around a very niche thing. 30 years ago, you probably didn't have a monthly newsletter that existed for small agencies. And now there's this channel and several others out there that are creating information specifically for small agencies. I've got a podcast that is specifically focused on influence marketing, which is niche as crazy as hell. But at the same time, that's the world we live in. You can have something really, really minute, a very small sliver of the world, and you can establish a voice on that. And if there's a handful of people out there that pay attention to it, then you have influence over them to a degree.
I have to say, I love how you looped in the whole small agency angle there. It's right in keeping with the video you created not long ago about how to be a good podcast guest. and so I'm glad that you're actually, living your own advice. But so let's talk about agencies a little bit as it applies to Winfluence. One of the things that you do in the book is talk very practically about the steps that you should be taking in order to be utilizing Winfluence to the advantage of the brand or the client. And so, talk a little bit about how Winfluence should change or give perspective to agencies and how they work with their clients.
Sure. I think the biggest thing is really on the front end of deciding your goals and deciding the audiences that you want to reach. That's the first two important steps in any marketing communication strategy. Why are you using influence? What are you trying to do with? And if you want to start by thinking, okay, let's think online influencers, and that's your starting point. But if you start there, take a couple steps back and say, our goal here is to influence an audience to take action. It might be, our target audience. It might be a subsegment of an audience that we're trying to, maybe it's even as granular as persuading state legislators to vote a certain way on an issue. If that's the case, you're not going to use an Instagrammer. You're going to use lobbyists. You're going to use other advocacy groups for, your state, government. But start out with your goals and define, okay, who is the audience we're trying to reach? What is the goal that we're trying to do? What are we trying to persuade them to do? And then when you get to the next step, the third step in the process after goals and audience is delineating the influential people you're going to use. And again, this might be online, but it might be offline. What you really have to ask yourself is who ultimately influences that audience. And again, if you are a brand that is, a local business and your primary customer is, middle-aged folks with teenage kids, the president of the local PTA may be your best influencer. And that person doesn't necessarily have to have an Instagram account or a YouTube account, but if you can work through them in a relevant way that allows them to turn to the PTA and say, this business is doing this and it benefits you, and I wanted to tell you about it. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a very effective influence marketing strategy, and it doesn't have anything to do with the internet. So the way that agencies should really rethink about this is take the internet out of the equation and look for channels of influence wherever they may be.
Right. Well, and many years ago, I remember this, I think the late 90s, a friend of mine was hired as a brand ambassador for a company that sold diced tomatoes in a can. I don't know whether it was Del Monte or something like that. And so she would host parties basically where she would make, we still to this day call it Dana's Dip, which was, basically like a queso with lots of tomatoes. And I don't know, it was very delicious, super unhealthy. But that's, so this is not something that has always been online, and there are a lot of ways that you can leverage all sorts of different venues in order to be effective at it. But as we think about agencies, one of the things that I want to hone in on is you talked about delineating the audience, or delineating the influencers. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is the importance of not relying too heavily on the technology, but also bringing in the human component. And I think this is a really important message for agencies, because there are a lot of agencies that use, on the media side, PR databases as a crutch. On the influencer side, there are lots of list building services, but there's really no substitute for really digging in and getting into that space and understanding who the true influencers are.
That's true. And I'll start out with, for those of you out there who have some experience in PR, I'll give you an analogy here. When you're delineating your influencers, if you're relying on the influence marketing tools and the databases to say, okay, you typed in this keyword, here's a list of 20 people you should go after. If you're taking that list of 20 people and then going after them without first going through each one and saying, is the computer making a good recommendation here? Double check the list. It would be like going into Cision or Meltwater or one of your PR databases and saying, I want everybody who writes about, scrapbooking, and then I'm going to blast them out a press release. Well, about 75% of the people who are going to come back with the keyword scrapbooking are people who don't, it's in some article that they wrote 3 years ago to have anything to do with them and what they do. And so you're wasting your time and you're wasting their time and potentially burning a relationship bridge by pitching someone something irrelevant. So think of influence marketing the same way. If you use these tools to say, here's 10 people you should reach out to, what you really need to do is go in and say, okay, is the tool giving me a good recommendation? Does this influencer's content, will it resonate with my audience? Does their audience and my audience overlap? Do they appear to be, committing any of the fraudulent behavior, like padding their follower counts with bot followers, or is there engagement, a bunch of emojis and one words where it's not really people having a conversation? That could be a red flag that it's bots that are having that conversation. So you've got to get in there and really look and see, does this influencer and their audience and their engagement and the previous sponsored posts that they've done, how well did they do at convincing their audience to take action for those clients that they had? That's how you're really going to zero in on the right influencers to use, or the right influential people to use, because the tools are only a point. They point you in the right direction. They don't give you the granular, this is absolutely the 10 that you need to use to work. They just say, here's a bunch that might work. You still got to make the might go away.
Right. Well, and I think that agencies really need to dig into the spaces in which they're in, so that they're they're not going to become as expert as their clients. And this is something that we always talk about. The client's always going to know more than you do about their own industry. But if you're their agency, you need to understand it beyond just what you're being asked to do, because that's how you can make the best judgments. And to your point, you need to look and see what those individuals have done previously with brands. Do they do paid promotions? Do they accept product, and do they disclose it, and all those kinds of things? Because if you're working with someone who's never worked with a brand before, that's going to be a very different experience than someone who does it regularly. And so there's a lot that you can learn from looking at their track record, whether it's on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, blogs, wherever they have an audience.
That's very true. And I'll give the agency folks out there a little bonus thing. So, if you're looking at the vertical that you are primarily, concerned with, like I think most everybody who knows me knows that I work with the bourbon industry a lot. And so if I type in bourbon into one of these tools and it spits out, 50 influencers, and that's who I'm targeted, who I'm targeting for influence outreach. That's one little world of people who are influential to the audience that I'm trying to reach. It's people, the bourbon people, the people who focus on the content around bourbon are the cocktail bloggers and the kind of what I call the bourbon nutters that are just talking about bourbon all the time. Well, what about the food bloggers, the people who create recipes with bourbon in the glazes and sauces they use? What about the lifestyle folks who the audience overlaps? Like maybe it's people who are into fashion and style, and it's fashion and style that overlays with my particular brand of bourbon, which is kind of a high fashion premium bourbon, right? So the agency your strategies will get a lot wider and a lot better when you say, okay, we've covered the main category, the bourbon category, if you will. We've covered that in terms of our influencer outreach. But now we've also gone out here to a tangential vertical and said, hey, these are 4 or 5 influencers in style or in lifestyle or in food or in some other category that's parallel. It still aligns with the brand. It still makes a ton of sense. And that's where you have kind of almost like a customer acquisition strategy with influencers in, let's go find people that don't know who we are, because the people here probably do.
Right. Well, and that's where you have an opportunity to be more creative as an agency and really flex your muscle. But it's also a way to address some of the challenges that you can have in some industries. And you being in the spirits industry, there are a lot of regulations, both governmental as well as industry, that govern how you can market things. And I love it. You had an example in the book about how you can find creative ways to work with influencers and make sure that you're living within those regulations, but still getting your message out.
Yeah, it's there was one in particular in the book, and it had to do with the bourbon brand, where we had received a request basically from the client to say, hey, we've got a retailer that is wanting us to do a little extra, legwork to drive more unit sales in their retail location. Well, in the spirits industry, you're technically the brands are not allowed to call out specific retailers. Because, I don't really know why. It's a regulation. I don't know all the back end of it, but we don't call out specific bars, specific restaurants. If you ever see someone calling out a specific bar or restaurant, it's not the brand. It's typically the distributor that's doing that. So just FYI, a little inside baseball there for you. But anyway, so we were trying to come up with an influence strategy, and it was in a geographic region of the country. And basically, the brand manager started asking a bunch of questions, and I was like, well, wait a minute, I think we can probably do this. And so I found a cocktail blogger who put together it was Spirited LA, Hannah Chamberlain. She put together this fantastic, here's the recipes that I would recommend putting together for a romantic Valentine's Day dinner at home if you want to cook for your significant other. And the bourbon was a part of the cocktail recipes, were a part of what she did in her post and promoted on her social channels. But she went one step further and said, and here's your grocery list to take to the store. And she listed out, a few retailers, including the one we were trying to hit, of here's where you can go to get this. And, item number 1 was the bourbon brand. So little clever ways to kind of get in there and solve really intricate problems that maybe the regulations don't allow you to do directly. You can find an indirect way to do it, still within the rules.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the other important things there is the importance that you talk about of having in mind what your call to action is.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you want people to do? How are you going to measure success, and making sure that all of your activities in the influencer space are tied back to that and not just being done because, hey, it sounds good to get iJustine to talk about it, but so what?
Yeah. Yeah. And Hannah did a great job of taking the challenge there, because, the challenge was, we got to drive people to buy this in a grocery store, not a liquor store, without calling out the grocery store. And so she said, well, here's your grocery store list. Number 1, bourbon.
Right.
Worked great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So talk a little bit about the measurement of the success of these programs, because, there are all sorts of people who say, well, you can't really measure word of mouth and influence very well. And I think you do a pretty good job of debunking that. And obviously agencies want to be able to prove success of their work because it's helpful for their existing client, but also for getting new ones.
Yeah, so I've always kind of scratched my head a little bit when people say you can't measure this, you can't measure that. The reality is, the truth is, you can measure anything, but you have to plan to measure on the front end. Normally, what people do that are frustrated or say they can't measure something is they get to the end of the campaign or the quarter or the month, and they say, okay, well, how did we do? Well, that's like getting to the end of the driveway with your family and saying, where are we going on vacation? You haven't bought tickets. You don't have reservations. You didn't take care of the pets. You haven't locked the door or whatever. Like,
that doesn't work. Are you sure?
It does not work. And so when you are, you always start with your goal, right? The deciding your goals is one of the first things you're going to do. At that moment, you are planning to measure, because you are saying, this is what we're going to measure. This is what we're trying to capture. So what you do on the front end is you say, okay, if our goal is foot traffic, if our goal is revenue, if our goal is awareness, if our goal is changing perception, whatever your goal may be, you have to have a starting point. So you measure first to say, where are we now? And if you're starting from zero, then it's easier to measure. You got zero. And so then you have to set some data traps along the way to benchmark and know how you're doing so that you can optimize and adjust. But then when you get to whatever the end point is where you have to report, and it's probably not an end point, it's just a checkpoint of either the month or the quarter or the year or the campaign, then you are able to look back at the data points and say, we started here and for your all's perspective, we started here and we got here. And the change is what you did, what you got out of it. And so again, if you start with measurement, when you define what your goal is and say, okay, how many do we have now? Then when you get to the end, you can easily say, okay, how many now do we have and what's the difference? And that's the success rate of your plan. The problem I think a lot of agencies and a lot of clients ultimately have, it's really more the clients, I think, than the agencies sometimes, is they constantly say, what's the ROI? How much money did we make? Well, if your goal was awareness, you don't measure awareness in dollars and cents, right? So it's the wrong question to ask. What you have to do as an agency is level set with the client, say, hey, our goal here is changing the perception of our company from this to that. And so we're not measuring this with dollars and cents. We're measuring this with a survey of what do you think about the company here versus what do you think about the company there. And if you manage those expectations and plan to measure on the front end, I don't think there's much you can't measure in influence marketing or anything else.
And you talk about the importance of defining those goals in advance, and it doesn't, I know a lot of the people who listen to this show, a lot of the agencies that I work with are not necessarily doing marketing or communications for selling a product or a specific service. They may be working for a cause or maybe doing public affairs or crisis or those kinds of things. But influencers can play a very important role there. And so Winfluence talks about a specific example, I think maybe a couple of examples about how you can leverage it for working on cause or information marketing as well.
Yeah, the probably the best example from the book, I think it's a little weird to think about, but it's Marie Curie, the hospice care brand in the United Kingdom, and they basically wanted to get sort of that middle-aged and older, probably mostly females, because they are making the decisions for extended care for parents or planning for themselves. But they really wanted to engage that audience in a conversation about death, which is a weird thing to try to engage people in a conversation about because nobody wants to think about it or talk about it. So they brought in some influencers to have the conversation in a very positive way of, hey, it's important to plan for these things. It's important to make sure that you have the appropriate health care set aside for your parents, for your aging, elders, and for yourself, of course. And so they were able to start a conversation in the greater consumer base because these influential people in certain verticals where it made sense for their content and the type of engagements they have, they were starting to have the conversation with their audience because Marie Curie kind of pushed over the first domino and gave them the assets and the opportunity to have those conversations. And so for a nonprofit or a cause, or if you're trying to do something like change the way people think about your brand, having those influential voices as a part of that conversation to help you amplify the changes that you're trying to affect is a great way to get the greater public to think about you a little differently.
Well, I think that that's a fantastic way of thinking about it, which is you want to make people think differently. Whether you're selling a product, a service, a cause, an issue, an idea, whatever, that's ultimately what all marketing is about, right? You're trying to get them to think about what you want them to do and then do what you want them to do after that.
Yeah, I mean, it's try, buy, or think. Those are the three things you're trying to get people to do. You either want them to try your product, buy your product, or think differently about your product, whatever that product may be, whether it's a consumer good or whether it's a cause or whether it's, just sort of the purpose that your brand serves. Try, buy, or think, and you can use influence marketing to do that. You can use a lot of other channels too, but influencers have a tendency to deliver that message in more effective ways these days, because if you choose the right one, they have a captive audience of people who are really engaged and trust their opinion on things. And so that's kind of the strategy you got to go after, is finding the right people who have the right impact over the audience you want to reach and work through them, collaborate with them so that they can create that content.
Well, as we inch up on the end of our time together here today, I want to sort of step up to a higher level and ask an existential question about the
Uh-oh.
book.
All right.
Why this book? Why now? I mean, what you're obviously an accomplished writer. You know what you're doing. What inspired you to write this book about this topic at this time?
Honestly, it was the mainstream media's, continued bashing of influencers and portraying them in a poor light. This is part of my livelihood. It's part of a lot of agencies' livelihood. What we're doing now with people who are influential voices online and potentially influential voices offline. And when I see documentaries like Fake Famous, or I see stories in BuzzFeed or the New York Times or Harper's Bazaar that only talk about the negative things that some crazy TikToker or Instagrammer did that is unethical or weird or out of line or something like that, it just frustrates me. And so there's not enough amplification of the good that can come from influence partners working with your brand. And I'm afraid that a lot of business owners out there, a lot of marketers, a lot of agency folks hear the term influencer marketing and immediately go, yeah, that's just a fad. It's not worth your while because they're all superficial and it's not a good investment. And I know that to be wrong. So I'm trying to kind of defend the audience of influencers out there and the practice of influencer marketing, because it can do wonderful things for your business or your brand or your clients.
And so finally, peering into the crystal ball, what evolution do you see in influencer marketing in the coming years, other than, of course, they adopt all the principles of influence?
Well, to be honest with you, I think we're still, the industry is still very immature. And there's still a lot to be
in more ways than one.
Yeah, there's a lot to be done in terms of just the growth of not only the sophistication of what influencers are doing and how they're partnering with brands, but how we're measuring it. The fraud detectors need to get a lot better. There's a lot of things that need to happen here. But ultimately, I think what we're going to see is influential voices online are going to be some percentage of the media that consumers consume on a regular basis. And therefore, just like radio, television, magazines, print, etc., that it's a channel that brands are going to have to embrace and understand and leverage for many, many years to come, because the world of publishing, the world of media is exploded now. It's a Pandora's box of a lot of noise. You got to find that signal, and that signal is not always going to be a traditional television network or broadcast property or media outlet. It's going to be some individual who has a very specific area of expertise around a very specific thing. And if that very specific thing is something that appeals to the audience you're trying to reach, that might be a really good way for you to reach that audience. And it's probably going to be a much more efficient way to spend your money too, rather than buying TV and print and all that good stuff. So I think this is just going to settle. The dust is going to settle, and influence marketing is going to be one of the array of channels that we use as agencies and as brands to reach our audiences.
Well, that's a fantastic way to wrap this up. And now I'm going to do what every influencer marketing campaign is targeted doing, which is give the call to action, which is that you should go to jasonfalls.com and buy the book. Buy Winfluence. He's got links on there for all sorts of different retailers where you can get it from. Yes, we'll both hold up the book here so that people can see it.
Forward by David Meerman Scott. That's good stuff right there.
Absolutely. Another New Englander. We always like to see New Englanders. So buy the book, buy a couple of copies, give them to a friend, and
buy them for all your clients. I mean, this is educational stuff, folks. 20 copies each now.
Well, I think now we're getting into a little heavy-handed influencer marketing, Jason. I think we maybe
buy what you're comfortable with.
But buy what you need.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Or maybe one or two more. I mean, David Meerman Scott talks in the forward about how he went out and bought a Mercedes Sprinter van because of an online conversation. Maybe that's a little bit on the extreme side of things.
Yeah,
that
you may not need two of those.
No, probably one of those is sufficient unless you're able to drive two vehicles at a time. And in the future, who knows, right? I mean, Tesla, self-driving. I mean, maybe I've got a whole caravan of Teslas driving along with me.
It's coming.
Yeah. In any case, Jason, thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you to the listeners and viewers for being with us. If you'd like to see a replay of this or any of the small agency shows, go ahead and go to smallagency.tv. You can see Jason's earlier interview with me a few months ago. You can see all sorts of other interesting conversations. Of course, we'll be back here on Small Agency TV on Friday at noon Eastern Time for our regular panel discussion. And if you'd like to join the Saga community for free, you can get all sorts of resources there. Just go to smallagencygrowth.com. So that will bring to an end today's show. I don't have to hit quite as many buttons as Jason does, so I have fewer things that I can screw up at the end of my show, because really, at this point, all I need to do is hit the end broadcast button and hope that it really ends and that our post-show conversation doesn't get sent out live. That would be bad. So thank you, and good night, or good day, whatever.